Norman had never thought of himself as a revolutionary. He had always imagined reformers as people who shouted in town squares or published manifestos, or at least had the decency to pick a suitably dramatic hat. Norman's revolution was of a quieter, more pedestrian sort. It involved marginalia. It involved a tiny stapler he kept in his breast pocket like a talisman, and the conviction that, if one lined up boxes precisely and wrote dates legibly, the universe would behave as politely as possible. So when he realized he needed allies, it did not occur to Norman to recruit anarchists or poets, though he knew several who could be useful in a latter-day emergency. Instead, he went to tea. The break room at the Department of Catastrophes had a kettle with the morale of a veteran civil servant. It gurgled without enthusiasm, but had never failed to boil when summoned. Around it, habits had congealed into an ecosystem. There were biscuit crumbs in Clifton's files, a stack of forms baptized with a single, earnest smudge of jam. It was here, amid the ritual of lukewarm hot water and the solemn distribution of sachets, that alliances began. Tom Chalk arrived like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence you thought would never conclude. He slouched in with the confidence of a man who had once argued with a minor god and had come off only slightly singed. Where Norman had thinly ironed suits and ink on fingernails, Tom had scuffed shoes and a tie that looked as if it had known better days. He regarded the kettle with a smirk of affectionate derision. "You look like someone who misplaced a particularly important paperclip," he said, peering at the folded paper Norman kept in his hand. "I misplaced a stamp," Norman said, "and then it misfiled itself, and then reality hiccuped. It's probably my fault." Tom grinned. "Wrong answer. Start again. You misplaced an obsolete administrative implement and accidentally triggered a sequence that a machine with the temperament of a bored literalist interpreted with shocking orthodoxy." Better. Norman did not feel better. He offered Tom the paper towel-wrapped stamp like a relic being returned to a church. Tom took it reverently, then less reverently, and eventually put it in his pocket as if it were a conversational gambit. Rita K. Finch arrived not with flourishes but with a binder. It was the sort of binder that implied the sum total of people who had ever been ignored and the possibility, without exaggeration, of a small revolution. Rita's entrance altered the acoustics of the room. Where Tom's presence created the possibility of jokes, Rita's created the possibility of organized chaos. "If you're trying to unwrite the end of the world," Rita said, opening the binder to a page that seemed thick with precedent, "we do not advise volunteering without representation." Norman stared at her. Representation. The department has rules about revocations. The union has rules about procedures. Between the two, we can file something that will force them to look at it. Or at least make them sit in a room long enough for us to chew the adhesive on our office chairs. Either way, it's preferable to panic. Panic, to Rita, was an administrative problem. Norman liked that. He liked how she treated cosmic crises as matters of contract and ergonomics. They found Mies Enoch in the sub-basement, where the air smelled faintly of cleaning solvent and old minutes. He was polishing his brass-handled mop with the kind of care reserved for sacred objects and antique instruments. There is a way an experienced custodian cleans that suggests he has been present for more than floors and forgotten coffee cups. Mitha. Enoch cleaned with the measured attention of someone who had once been present at the signing of things. He seemed, from the stains on his overalls and the steady warmth behind his eyes, to recall a dozen governments and half a mythology's worth of memos. "You want to know if an exception exists," he said without preamble, as if the question had been sitting in the air for some time. They put the exceptions in the margins so people would read less of them. He led them past files that smelled like afternoon sunlight and dust, and opened a ledger whose pages were thin and slightly seraphic with age. He tapped a line in the margin with the butt of his mop. The text he pointed to was written in a cramped, patient script and had an addendum in a hand that sagged into the border. Curative Act. Where human testimony and a non-departmental appeal are provided, precedent can be created. Condition: curative acts must not create unreasonable risk of further ad hoc endings. If you can find an appeal from someone very important, Enoch said, closing the ledger with a soft thud, you have something to move with. Norman felt his pulse do the peculiar thing it did when he discovered a footnote that made the world slightly more complicated and slightly more hopeful at once. He wrote the phrase down in his notebook in small, careful letters. The handwriting made the sentence feel smaller and therefore more possible. There was, of course, the question of who qualified as someone very important. In bureaucratic contexts, the title was slipperier than it sounded. In ordinary life, it would be a minister or a director. In departments that managed reality, it could be anyone who enjoyed biscuits and veto power. Norman had one mental image: a recluse who had a finely polished teacup and a refusal to be interrupted by unsolicited paperwork. Azra arrived when the office was half empty and the lighting had the indecisive quality of afternoon that could not decide if it wanted to be evening. Azra's coat shimmered in a way that made fluorescent strips seem frankly pedestrian. There was a small flock of paper clips that clustered around Azra's cuff like birds around a lamppost. "How do you like your biscuits?" Azra asked, accepting an offered plate with the solemnity of a monarch and the appetite of someone who had been on secondment long enough to appreciate novelty. Norman, who knew far more about forms than metaphysics, waited to be told what kind of fee a minor deity might accept. He had imagined gold or a small sun, or perhaps a declamatory poem. Azra accepted a paperclip and a stale chocolate biscuit with equal delight. "Paperclips are the currency of contracts," Azra said, speaking in elliptical metaphors that might have come from an oracle who had taken a course in corporate governance. "And biscuits are the unit of measurement for human stubbornness. Exchange them for favors wisely." The favor, insofar as Azra would favor anything that was not quite a miracle and not quite wholly contractual, was to translate the metaphysical part of Norman's problem into something that could be presented on paper without being gibberish. Azra did this by describing the mechanism of a revocation as if explaining the plumbing of a cathedral to a plumber who only understood architectural metaphors. It made sense, unimaginably, and felt as if the cosmos had finally provided a diagram in which the pipes were labeled with sticky notes. "We can provide cover," Azra said, nibbling at a biscuit. "Not erasure, not realignment, those are the ambitions of the very important and the very bored. We can provide a way to gather the evidence, to make the human case legible to people who think in clauses. But there are costs. Paperclips go missing. Biscuits develop crumbs. It will be messy, messy," Norman repeated. The word had sounded to him like a small benediction. Ariavost agreed to step out from behind her red pen long enough to listen. She had been, when Norman had first met her, the implicable shape of the department, neat, authoritative, the sort of person whose memos could cause lesser clerks to feel the seasons shift. Yet when she heard the ledger Mr. Enoch produced and the plan Azra suggested, something guarded and brittle in her softened. "If we are going to expose ourselves," Aria told them, "we will do so in a way that the directorate cannot dismiss as amateurish. If you will bring me testimony, and if you will do it through channels that leave a paper trail, I will authorize limited access to the protocol archive. You have 1 week." "1 week," said Gideon Furl when he piped up from behind the humming of his console. Gideon had been listening. He had been listening because listening, for a systems analyst, was mostly a pleasure. He had been following log files like a person follows a loved one's handwriting. The access he could provide would not be glamorous. He could, however, make sure that their visits to the archive were recorded in a way that could not be dismissed as subterfuge. "Access tokens will be strict," Gideon warned. "You will be watched. The archive likes witnesses, oddly enough. It prefers them to be deliberate." "We will be deliberate," Writer said, "and we will bring witnesses." We will organize testimony from people whose lives demonstrate the value of mess. Midwives, teachers, a man who keeps a stubborn dog alive by yesterday's leftovers. Those are the sorts of human things that cannot be easily translated into the directorate's calculus. Tom snorted. You mean people who improvise and do not hide behind regulations when someone needs them. We will stage small humanity. We will not stage humanity, Norman said, but his voice was small and carried the tremor of someone learning to argue with the world. We will gather it. We will bring what is real. And then, as if the cosmos had been listening from behind an opaque pane and decided it was time to speak, an envelope arrived. It settled upon Aria's desk with the finality of a paper gavel. The stamp was dark and official. The words within were blunter than the group had hoped, a notice of a cosmic audit. The directorate's auditors would arrive in a manner the department's memos assured them was less theatrical than actual disasters and more thorough than negligence. The phrase cosmic audit sounded to Norman like a reprimand from a parent who had once been excited about you and now suspected the worst. To everyone else in the room, it sounded like a deadline. An audit will look for precedent, Tom said, reading the single-sentence directive aloud with his usual dramatic timing. They will catalogue anomalies and make sure nothing sets precedent. In short, they will be very, very good at being fearful about the future. Rita slammed her binder shut with the authority of someone who negotiated lunchroom schedules into law. Then we must be quicker. The union will call for testimonies and a formal petition. We will mobilize. We will gather the midwives and the teachers and the improbable men who sustain stray animals. We will make the world legible to them in a way their auditors cannot ignore. They will try to privatize endings. While they are at it, Gideon muttered, I have logs of meetings with parties who have the sort of pockets that make auditors' suits look fragile. They talk about efficiencies and revenue streams. Privatize the end of the world, Tom said, as if tasting the words for the absurdity they deserved. Sell the last breath as a subscription service. Paper apocalypse. Premium catastrophe tiers with complimentary towels. How do you monetize an afterlife? You do not monetize an afterlife, Aria said, with the exact moral precision a clerk reserves for doctrinal matters. You do, however, prevent private entities from setting dangerous precedents. If the audit is ideological, it will be framed in a language their shareholders understand. We must frame our argument in a language the directorate understands, documented precedent, witness testimony, careful channels. The week that followed looked like the inside of a clock being rewired by people who normally only cleaned clocks and took lunch breaks. Rita sat at a table that became a command center. Writer's binder expanded to include lists, sub-lists, and an appendix of emergency biscuits. Tom wandered corridors whispering suggestions that ranged from the brilliant to the ridiculous, and sometimes both at once. Norman wrote letters and received them back annotated in red pen, which felt like a strange but necessary intimacy. Meh. Enoch took them to the basement ledger at the oddest hours and hummed the tune of a lullaby that sounded suspiciously like the early minutes of creation. They filed petitions for access and waited. The archive answered with a careful bureaucratic nod. Limited viewing would be allowed, the memo said. But the archive, like many institutions that contained the bones of older events, enjoyed being unhelpful in ways that were almost affectionate. The restricted subsection Norman needed made him wear a badge and enter alone, while a camera watched him like a conscientious ancestor. The logs recorded his breath and the timid scratching of his pen. Gideon, from his console, sent tiny assurances across cables and fiber optic threads. We will watch the watchers, he said in the language of systems, and he meant it. Inside the archive, the air had the dryness of a place that had been preserved not out of reverence, but because it made paperwork last longer. It smelled faintly of old glue, and the sort of seriousness that settles in when centuries of forms cross-validate each other. Norman knelt, absurdly, to examine a drawer labeled obsolescence protocols. It contained, more importantly than the label suggested, not merely forms but the memory of forms, comments in the margins, the cool jibes of clerks long dead, and an amendment written in a hand that rejoiced in old coffee stains. That amendment, scrawled in a cautious, apologetic script, mentioned curative acts almost as if embarrassed by the mere existence of mercy. When he emerged from the archive, Norman felt as if he had been given a map to a place he had always thought unreachable. He had in his hands a thread of legitimacy. He had the ledger, he had Rhetta's binder, he had Azra's odd metaphors, and he had Tom's talent for making doors look like suggestions rather than obstacles. But he also had the envelope from the directorate, which sat like a night watchman on his desk, audit imminent. "They will come prepared to be frightened of everything new," Tom said, leaning against a file cabinet as it hiccuped in sympathetic solidarity with the rest of the world. "Auditors are trained to distrust precedent that smiles. Then we will make precedent that smiles and has receipts," Rita said, folding her hands into the shape of someone who had once negotiated a contract with a dragon. Norman's hand went to his tiny stapler. He had never felt more certain that janitorial alliances, biscuit economics, and marginalia could save a world than he did in that moment. He also felt, beneath the certainty, the cold, thin thread of fear that anyone who kept their life glued to lists would feel when asked to improvise. The week ahead unfolded as a choreography of small surreptitious heroics. Rita called in favors. Midwives agreed to testify about the improvised brilliance that often saved infant lives in hospitals where paperwork had not caught up with circumstance. A teacher from a small town prepared a statement about a day she had given up a prep period to feed 3 families after a flood. Tom found a man who cared for stray dogs and persuaded him to describe in a sworn testimony why good enough had saved a neighborhood. "Musha," Enoch wrote in faded pencil, an account of an old council meeting in which a decision had been delayed for a committee that never met, and that delay had prevented a rash conclusion. Azra, oddly moved by the human testimony, agreed to provide character references for habit and improvisation in the register of minor deities. Gideon prepared logs that could not be easily disputed, and Clara fed everyone when they forgot to eat. All of this felt, in the moment, like building something fragile from paper and bread. It was, they all agreed privately, the only thing they could do. And so they did it. They made the thing you can make when official structures are too large to pivot. They made testimony that was both honest and impossible to dismiss at once. When the memo announcing the audit returned to the directorate's files with the faintest flourish of ribbon, Norman understood that they had bought themselves a different kind of problem. They had made themselves visible in ways dangerous and necessary. Somewhere, a cadre of auditors put on their best suits and practiced looking appalled at new ideas. The directorate, which had been content with its stamped straight order, was preparing to examine the department's minutes with the sort of scrutiny that made old rules feel like a comfort and new ones feel like a treasonous novelty. Norman, standing in the doorway of the archive with a folder of brittle testimonies, felt very small and very large at the same time. He realized, with a clarity that made the inside of his chest sound like a teacup, that alliances were not grand proclamations but small, stubborn acts, a biscuit offered, a paperclip traded, a ledger read in the half-light of a basement corridor. The allies they had gathered were not the sort of people who wrote manifestos. They were the sort who kept the world running by improvisation, by small acts of kindness, and by the ability to file a complaint with legal precision. And beyond them, in a building that smelled faintly of ink and authority, Auditor Primus paced. They would arrive, Primus would declare, because the department had the unseemly habit of making exceptions. It was Primus' job to be vigilant against the careless expansion of mercy. Norman thought of Primus as an immovable object made of good intentions and a dislike for precedent. They will be less like judges and more like people who have never met a footnote they did not want to remove, Tom said, trying to lighten the mood. Bring sandwiches that are both tasteful and legally defensible. Bring biscuits, Rita corrected, and bring witnesses. And bring me your forms properly collated. Norman, for once, managed to smile back at the world. The smile did not erase his fear. It did something else. It made the fear feel like a tool. He would file. He would collect testimonies. He would learn the strange and complicated art of improvising within rules. He would stand beside his new allies and, if necessary, look Auditor Primus in the face and say that some things were worth messy precedent. When the kettle went off that evening, it did so with a triumphant bubble. For once, the sound seemed less like a small domestic appliance and more like an unlikely trumpet. Norman put his stapler away, tightened his collar, and prepared to be a part of a thing he had never imagined he would join, a modest, paperwork-fueled rebellion in defense of the human right to be imperfect. Outside, the world still hiccuped. Inside, the department made plans, the allies took notes, the janitor hummed to himself. And somewhere, in an office whose blinds made decisive patterns on the carpet, a black envelope waited in the directorates in basket for the auditors to sign and carry away. It would be there, Norman suspected, like a storm front. They would arrive soon. They would ask for precedent. And when they asked, Norman and his small, improbable committee would answer with biscuits, paperclips, marginalia, and testimony that smelled like actual human life. If you had asked Norman what he expected when he set out with a stamp and a sandwich, he would not have predicted how ordinary the rebellion would feel. He did not foresee how many people would be willing to testify that messy, improvisational acts had mattered. He did not foresee how, in a bureaucracy devoted to the sublime, human tenderness would suddenly become the most compelling evidence of all. But he had learned something that week, that allies arrive in biscuit form and ledgered margins, and that sometimes the best way to answer a cosmic institution is with a stack of forms that hum with the warmth of real lives. The audit would come. They would have a dossier, and if Norman's hands trembled when he turned the binder over to Rita, that tremble was, he decided, an honest one. They had a week, they had allies, they had a plan. The directorate would be watching, Auditor Primus would be waiting, and in the quiet corners of the archive, a marginal pencil note flapped like a small, brave flag curative act with witnesses and a non-departmental appeal. The note looked, against the dullness of policy, like a promise. The chapter, if chapters could have hearts, ended not in triumph or collapse, but in the peculiar limbo of preparation. Norman walked back to his desk with the folder under his arm and the sound of the kettle in his ears. He felt, in the way only someone who has spent decades making lists can feel, both terrified and resolutely ready. The next step would be to gather the world in paper. The one after that would be to present it to people who were very good at saying no. But they were no longer alone. And somewhere, beyond his control, the directorate's auditors adjusted their ties and made room in their schedules for an unpleasant possibility that precedent could, in fact, be made by people who smelled of biscuits and who wrote lovingly in margins. Norman, clutching his stapler, considered the absurdity of saving the world with a tiny piece of metal and some carefully compiled testimonies, and felt, ridiculously, as if he had been promoted. A week then, a ledger, allies, a looming audit, and a marginal note that said, faintly and in pencil, perhaps. The kettle boiled again, as if to applaud. The protocol archive smelled faintly of paper, lemon biscuits, and an old kind of seriousness that had once been useful, and was now mostly ornamental. Norman had imagined archives before the dim rooms of his childhood library, where card catalogues kept secrets about summer reading lists, but this was an archive that had been built when endings were first scheduled, which meant the shelves were not simply physical furniture, but curators of generations of consequences. They descended to it like a pilgrimage, though Area would have called it a tactical access request and Rita would have called it a health and safety nightmare. Hal led the way, his boots whispering on the metal stairs, Gideon trailing with a satchel of cables and a face that had learned to show too many emotions at once by way of diagnostic quirk. Clara carried a tin of biscuits, as if to lubricate fate with baked goods. Tom drifted behind, puckish and unbothered, except that there was a small, resolute line at the corner of his mouth that suggested he was more invested than he let on. Azra flitted between them like a coat on a hook that occasionally rearranged the hooks. The archive itself was a room that did not seem able to decide what century it belonged to. There were card catalogs and oak shelving, and then, inexplicably, a bank of humming terminals whose translucent screens displayed syntax that belonged to several dead programming languages, and one that probably never existed at all. The ceilings were high enough to be reverent. Somewhere beneath the reverence, the pipes sang a minor key, and the emergency lights blinked with the patient rhythm of someone rehearsing a complaint. Norman felt his spectacles slip as he looked around. Up here on the 8th floor, with memos and teapot and the faint smell of burnt kettle, the department had the air of being a place where nothing much happened. Down here, among the ledgers and the charters, things had historically happened forever. So this is where they keep all the bits nobody's supposed to look at, Tom observed, fingers resting on a ledger spine as if it might bite. You can tell by the way the dust has formed committees. Please keep comments to a minimum in the presence of the archive, Arya said, though it came out almost fond. She had a red pen that reflected the archive lamps in a sharp, unwavering arc. Gideon took off his glasses and peered at a column of faint ink, his breath fogging a tiny hollow on the page. He was the sort who treated logs not as records but as companions, aligning their syntax into sentences the way some people arranged flowers. He set a small scanner against a page, and the machine hummed like a sufficiently awake insect. They were led by Hall to a subsection labeled with a brass plaque that read Protocol Archive, Restricted. The lock had the kind of combination that made Tom whistle appreciatively. Rita produced a stack of forms she had negotiated and folded with the same tenderness some people used to fold sweaters, and no one would have blamed her. You do realize there's a cosmic audit queue for this kind of thing, Gideon murmured as he set to work. They're not fans of people poking at precedent. They are less fond of people who allow an activated Armageddon to go without redress, Arya said. All the more reason to be careful. Rita clicked her binder shut and handed Norman a page that had been stamped with a dozen approvals, union seal, temporary access, health indemnity. Take it slow, she said. There's history in the margins and politics in the boxes. Also, do not touch the green ribbon unless you're comfortable with metaphysical consequences. Norman held the sheet like a talisman. To him, the archive felt like an attic populated by a civilization's marginalia, annotations that had been scrawled in panics, amendments that smelled faintly of grief, and a lot of commas placed with heroic indecision. He approached a cabinet and opened drawer after drawer. Each one had its own personality. Some drawers sighed with relief when opened. Others regretted the disturbance and made Norman feel like he had interrupted a nap. It was both ridiculous and immediate. He could feel that the world outside was hiccuping and folding, and that somewhere in these drawers someone had written about how best to mop up the washing machine. Gideon, in his quiet, meticulous way, was already at a terminal, feeding lines of old archive format into a conversion algorithm he had written in the small hours after too much tea. His fingers moved with the kind of confidence Norman admired, but could never quite emulate. There's a lot of cross-linked marginalia, Gideon said. People used to write their feelings in the margins in case the statute didn't cover them. People were simpler then, Clara said, offering 2 biscuits. Or at least they thought they were. Clara's biscuits were more than morale. They had the technician's effect of altering humidity and morale simultaneously. Norman accepted one and felt guilty, which was facially a good sign that he was still himself. Azra perched on the edge of a reference table, and watched Gideon work with the faint amusement of someone who had once rearranged a constellation for the laugh of it. "The archive is less a place and more an attitude," Azra said, bits of confetti in their eyes catching the lamps. "It collects certainties the way a hedgehog collects leaves." "Can archives get hungry?" Norman asked before he thought. It was the kind of half-joke that came from years of trying to make paper feel less like an adversary. "Only if people feed them cliches," Azra said. "Bring something original." It was, in a way, what Gideon was doing. He was feeding the archive something besides the same old petitions and memos. Syntax that could translate the archaic encoding into language the modern systems and the living could understand. The screen flickered as the conversion algorithm not so much rewrote the past as reintroduced it. Lines slipped into clarity, amendment numbers, cross-references, a note in a particularly crabbed hand that read, "Curative exceptions to be applied with irrefutable human testimony and either someone very important's signature or an immediate proxy authorized by the Charter's annex." "Irrefutable human testimony," Gideon repeated, and the words had the weight of a bell. "There's a marginal amendment here, a sort of postscript. It's obscure, it looks like someone tried to hedge certainty with poetry, but it's real." Norman felt his hands go cold. "So we can?" he asked. And the question stopped short between them because the rest was the kind of thing one was not supposed to say out loud in a room where the past had been cross-indexed for future use. "Potentially," Aria said. "But it requires precedent, testimony," and she tapped her lapel pin as if summoning authority, a proxy in an order that is rarely invoked. Rita snapped her binder open and rifled through notes. "Someone very important is notoriously elusive. They accept petitions via a set ritual. A proxy signature is permitted, but only if the proxy is recognized and the testimony incontrovertible. So we need human stories that are so flagrantly, undeniably human that no amount of policy could weight them down," Tum observed, and if his voice was wry, there was nonetheless an edge of brightness to it, the kind that happens when a puzzle becomes a puzzle plus stakes. "And we have to get this in before the audit," Gideon said. "If the auditors lock precedent, while everything's still open, the archive will be sealed, and that amendment will be just another footnote." The reality engine sat outside in the hum of the building like a professional with a headache, indifferent but resolute. Down here, among artifacts and annotations, the idea of precedent had an almost ecological quality. Some precedents were ancient trees. Others were opportunistic seedlings that could, with the right amount of water and argument, root themselves and grow into rules. At that moment the lights threw a shadow that belonged to someone tall and purpose-built. A mid-level clerk, even Ma, materialized at the end of the aisle. He wore ambition like a new suit. "I thought I might assist," he said, and for a second the words were small enough to be innocuous. "Assistance by whom?" Rita asked, not unkindly but with the compact clarity of someone who had never met Even but could already smell his motives. Even smiled as if he had been waiting for the archival moment to dress up in his professional face. "I have been following the case file. I thought perhaps I could be of service to the Directorate. The Directorate is not taking volunteers of the undisclosed ambition sort," Aria said. "Work is allocated through channels." Even's smile flickered. He stepped forward and his hands landed on a restricted box with a casualness that was practiced. "A small favor," he said. "Surely we can be expedient in times of crisis." Efficiency Rita's hand closed on a binder as if it were an animal she had interrupted mid-mischief. "Efficiency is not a free pass for opportunism," she said. "You'll need the proper authorization. Temporary access doesn't mean temporary ethics." Hull put himself between Ivan and the box in a way that was more territorial than confrontational. "Access is through Sir Barrow's log," he said. "I can't authorize without coordination." Even browbeat them with the practiced ease of someone who had swallowed a primer on rhetorical climb. "This is a chance to prove one's initiative," he said. "Auditor Primus respects decisive actors." A silence fell like a page turned too fast. Norman watched the exchange and felt that strange animal in his chest that was neither fear nor pride, but a small and growing conviction that things required more than doing procedures by the book. This, he could say, was not the book's fault. The book had always been a repository of human attempts to make sense. It had not expected ambition to look so tidy. Tom's smile dropped. Primus has been less disposed to heroics lately and more to precedent, Tom said. If you try anything less than scrupulous, even you'll find the directorate's disapproval is very literal. Evan's jaw tightened, and he took his hands from the box. He left with a parting glance that promised complications. The threat was not dramatic. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of a ticking clock, small, regular, and relentless. "Hell make it worse for us," Gideon said once Evan had gone. "If he tattles, Primus might fast-track the seal to show decisive authority. Then we must be faster," Arya said. She took the marginal note Gideon had highlighted and circled the lines with the precision of someone who had once delayed a catastrophe for love and had kept the procedure like an icicle of memory. "We build precedent in the margins. We must be rigorous and human in equal measure." Azra hovered and spun an index card between luminous fingers. "The archive loves a good story," they said, "but it respects corroboration." Gideon leaned back, the hum of the terminal filling the space like a companionable cough. "There's an amendment here, yes, but notice the clause. It calls for irrefutable testimony. The language is deliberately theatrical. Whoever wrote it wanted to protect the archive from whimsy, so our evidence cannot be theatrical. It must be small and stubborn and utterly human." Norman found his throat wet with a kind of honest panic. Irrefutable testimony sounded like something that should be presented by a tribunal or recorded on national stone. Instead, it demanded things like midwives improvising deliveries, teachers pausing syllabi to rescue a child's day, a baker giving away loaves in a blackout. These were not epics. They were acts that would not have registered in policy logs, but would have indelibly demonstrated human worth. "We will have to gather them," Rita said. "We will have to create a thread of human things so plainly undeniable that the directorate cannot refuse to see the pattern. And we must do it before the audit," Gideon said. "If the audit arrives and decides to privatize the department, it will have an interest in precedent that supports saleable finality." A chill slid along the shelves. "Private contractors," Gideon said, "would not be invested in preserving messy human mercy. They would like tidy endings. They would like profitable certainty." The thought made Norman's teeth ache with indignation. "So we collect moments," Tom said, and for once his smirk was plain and earnest. "We gather small, blunt, human stories that will be better than a signature and worse than a miracle." They worked until the terminal glowed with an archived tree, lines and references that could be argued from now until tea time and beyond. They made lists, ticked boxes, and wrote witness requests with the kind of care Norman had once reserved for his mother's letters. Clara folded another biscuit into a napkin and passed it around. By the time they left the archive, each of them carried a kind of quiet that was half exhaustion and half purpose. They had, in a way, moved from panic to plan. Norman felt oddly light despite the gravity. Intention had been made out of fear, and sometimes that could be enough to move a mountain, or at least to postpone its formal appointment. Hall, as they ascended the stairs, said softly, "You all know this will change things, yes? If we find evidence and present it, they'll have to reckon with the charter in a way they haven't in a very long time." Arya's red pen tapped the rail. "Change is precisely what the department has needed for years," she said, and Norman thought he heard, for an instant, the softness beneath her armor. They emerged into the fluorescent daylight of the department, like people who had returned from deeper waters. Upstairs, the kettle hummed its patient, lukewarm song. The world outside was slightly hiccuped. A streetlight blinked, as if deliberating whether to be afternoon or evening. Prophet voicemail cues ticked on, indifferent and ridiculous. But underneath that small absurdity there was a new plan, an evidence-gathering circuit of human kindness, a campaign of tiny proofs to be marshaled into irrefutable testimony. They had, Gideon said, an amendment and a direction. They also had a mid-level clerk with a taste for promotion who might, at the most inconvenient moment, write to Auditor Primus with the kind of honest, accurate account that was designed to make him look decisive. Norman's stomach made a small grieving noise. He felt suddenly and entirely responsible without feeling particularly heroic. That was perhaps where he always lived, at the threshold between procedure and improvised error, which was to say, honestly human. Azra brushed Norman's sleeve with an absent, glittering hand. "Go get them their stories," they said. "And remember, the archive likes the inconvenient truth more than polished lies." He looked at the faces around him, at Reiter's steady hands, at Aria's pin, at Gideon's tired devotion. He thought of the amendment in the marginalia, and the list of things that would count as irrefutable. He thought of the midwife he didn't know, and the teacher who might bend a schedule for a child's sake. He thought of even Ma and his tidy ambitions. Outside, somewhere, the world hiccuped again. A mountain hiccuped, and shook its head as if it had swallowed a pebble, and Norman, with his ink-stained fingers and his stapler tucked like a comfort, began to make a plan that was as close to courageous as he had ever been. They would collect testimony. They would make precedent. They would go out into a world that was falling into absurdity and gather the ordinary bravery that would save it. And in the back of Norman's mind, like a footnote waiting to be read, the biggest worry remained. Would Pandora's auditors see their work and call it precedent worth sealing against the very mercy they sought? The question, like a margined line, leaned toward them with expectation. The chapter closed not with a decisive signature, but with a file packet unsealed and a list forming: midwife contact, teacher witness, bakery voucher, prophet voicemail excerpt. It closed with the image of Norman, clutching his tiny stapler, walking back through the department to a teapot that never seemed to boil properly, and a phone line that was held open by bureaucracy and hope in equal measure. And if the archive had a voice, it would have whispered in the kind of dry, amused way that things which have seen a great deal whisper: "Be careful what you prove. The past will always come to call you by the name you used when you were small." Beyond the lamps and ledgers, in a room where policy was worshipped and footnotes were altars, Auditor Primus made notes on an unreadable tablet and decided, in the cool of archival clarity, that this matter would be worth watching. Which was, Norman suspected with a mixture of dread and relief, both the beginning of their work and the trapdoor beneath it. The audit loomed like a scheduled storm. The amendment waited like a delicate instrument, and the team stepped, with sticky biscuits and legal pads, into the errand of making mercy legible. They had begun to write a story that would have to be believed. And belief, the archive cautioned, is often better when it's in triplicate. The lights of the department pulsed with an officious cadence as they returned. Upstairs, memos awaited their signatures, and the teapot coughed. Norman set his stapler down, and for once, he did not feel the urge to line up every paper perfectly. The world was wobbly, so were the rules. He had a pen with which to write marginalia, and if nothing else, that would have to be enough. Outside, a lamppost winked as if conspiratorial. Inside, a drawer had been opened. Between them, the rest of the work waited to be done. And someone very important, somewhere, was being fanned a biscuit and briefed on the merits of marginalia and mercy. The thought was both infuriating and oddly comforting. The audit was coming. The archive had given them a way forward. They had, at least, a beginning. The rest would be stories.